We're back with the latest on the revolt in Russia. The Wagner Group, a particularly brutal and violent group of mercenary forces in Russia that have been critical to Russia's ability for its military to hold steady, if you can say that, in its war in Ukraine, standing down after appearing armed and ready to march to and take on the Kremlin. Let's turn to our team of experts to talk about this. Barry McCaffrey's here, retired four-star general, and Jason Beardsley, a U.S. Navy and Army Special Forces veteran. Missy Ryan is still with us. General McCaffrey, you know, when we talk about what losing Prigozhin or the Wagner forces would mean for Russia's military, as a military blow to Russia, it is because of their particularly brutal and violent tactics that they've had any battlefield successes at all. Just broaden the lens a little bit for us and talk about this force in Russia and this now thorn and international humiliation for Putin.
Well, I think the bottom line is the humiliation of Putin. There's just absolutely no way he hasn't been massively weakened by this. The Wagner Group probably is around 25,000 troops, maybe 10,000 civilian contractors. The Russian armed forces, its various pieces of it, National Guard, Interior Ministry, Riot Police, FSB, are about 1.4 million. So I think Wagner Group, Prigozhin, thought he could get him to flip to him. On the face of it, it didn't make any sense. This guy's a criminal. The leadership of Wagner Group tends to be motivated by greed. They get to steal gold, diamonds, oil in Africa and elsewhere in the world. So it's sort of a shaky proposition. I wouldn't want to overstate the importance of the Wagner Group to the Russian combat effort in Ukraine. The Air Force, the Navy, the bulk of artillery, the most important branch in the Russian army, the bulk of the armored troops are all Russian army, not Wagner Group. They were about 25,000 people. When they deserted, they got cut up and tortured to death. They had huge, maybe 30,000 casualties, we think. So although I do think they were a violent and brutal component of the effort in Ukraine, they were not the sum total of the Russian armed forces' threat to the Ukrainians, who, by the way, though, are immensely better off today than they were a week ago. There's just no question that the 60% of the Russian army are conscripts, are draftees. These poor boys are starting to think, what am I doing here? So it's a good outcome for Ukraine and for the temporarily for the West.
General McCaffrey, you have a tweet up that caught all of our attention. As soon as I saw it, I read it, but I want to put it up for our viewers. It's about the fate of Prigozhin. You write this: Prigozhin couldn't get the Russian army to come over as expected. He folded his hand. FSB will eventually detain him for investigation. Then he will be murdered in the coming 90 days. Putin, immeasurably weakened, makes him very desperate and dangerous. The prediction of 90 days, I think a lot of people think that might not take him that long.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I think right now in the Kremlin, the principal thing they're trying to do is diffuse the Wagner Group, and most of them will go away. You notice they said only those who hadn't taken part in the rebellion would be offered contracts. So you're going to try and integrate convicted murderers and child molesters into the Russian army? I don't think so. The rest of them are suddenly without a job, and they're vulnerable to being arrested by the FSB or the Interior Ministry. So, I mean, when you look at it, Prigozhin, the minute he walks away from his armed retinue, and by the way, a bunch of them will probably try and get into Belarus, but Belarus got 20,000 Russian troops there. They're an occupied country. So they're trying to figure out, how do we get rid of the Wagner threat? Then we can detain the nice man, and then we'll kill him in the most appropriate time and manner.
Jason, how do you think Pentagon leaders are assessing this moment for the war in Ukraine?
Well, you know, I think General McCaffrey makes some great points on, you know, the forces that have been in disposition on the defensive lines in Ukraine come from the bulk of the Russian army, the armor, the artillery, the air. They've been dug in and they've created some very defendable space. So the prospect for the Ukrainian forces, though emotionally and spiritually, if you will, has maybe buoyed a bit from this internal warfare. But on the ground, we're still in the same position. Managing to mount a capable offense that can penetrate a well dug in defense of combined arms is extremely difficult. And the Ukrainian army, not much different than the Russian army, has been fraught with internal factionalization and enough infighting on their own. So there's a lot of division politically there as well. The prospects are not bad, but I think we need to temper any sort of excitement or predictions because this has got a long way to go before we see the full ramifications. And I would suggest that Prigozhin's move was probably one of the most reasonable moves he could make for himself, having already kind of walked out on a plank, guaranteeing his death some months ago as he started to really voice his criticism against the military elite Gerasimov and Shoigu. That also provides a little top cover for Putin to frame the debacle, this disaster in Ukraine, on the current sort of Moscow gang that's in charge of the defense. So there's a lot of unfolding things here, and there's a lot of things we don't know. But for Prigozhin to walk away with, at least on paper, the terms of a sort of a deal, it's probably the best he was going to get, and I think he knew that.
You know, Missy, one of the things that Russia watchers hope for, and certainly people who've covered the war and covered the atrocities in Bucha and the brutality of the Wagner Group and I mean, Barry McCaffrey makes a great point. The Russian military has that in its ethos as well, the brutality and the violence, and it's why there are so many open investigations into war crimes that have been committed. But the wishful thinking that Putin might fall because of a dissenter from the left, from the pro-democracy side, seems like as big of a fantasy as ever. Of course, this was a threat from the other side, from the right, someone more hawkish, if you will, to his military strategy. What does it tell us about Russia?
Well, the concern that I'm hearing is not that Putin could claw back stronger than ever, but that he is, as we've said, significantly weakened, even though this crisis has been diffused to some extent, that, you know, he emerges with the perception of not only reliance on Wagner in Ukraine and elsewhere, might I say, you know, in places from Syria to Libya to Africa to project Russian power throughout the world, but he can't even control this element that has become such an important part of Russia's arsenal. And so, you know, I think that the concern is that, you know, he is less predictable, more dangerous. You know, Russia still has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And the concern is that he could, you know, be willing to take risks that he wasn't willing to take before because he perceives threat to his own existence. You know, for a long time, we've been looking at the war in Ukraine and wondering, why is Putin doing what he's doing? It doesn't seem like he's making decisions based on what he thinks is the best thing for the Russian people or for the Russian state, but increasingly as he faces, you know, arrest warrants from the ICC, increasing political isolation and sanctions, he is talking about his own and seeking to advance his own personal survival. And so the worry that I think a lot of people in the U.S. government and across NATO have at this moment is, what does a weakened, cornered Putin mean for the world? And could that actually be more dangerous than the Putin that we've been worrying about, you know, for all of these years?
Yeah, I think there was some reporting that their economy is at its weakest since the war began.